On July 5, 2026, Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet voted unanimously to refuse a Supreme Court order. No Israeli government has ever done this before. 48 hours earlier, the court had frozen a decision that would let the government control broadcast media. And Netanyahu said no. "I'm David. Here's what breaks when power rejects the courts." On Thursday, July 2nd, Israel's Supreme Court threw out an election. Michael Rabelo, Netanyahu's personal attorney, had just been elected State Comptroller, the country's chief government watchdog. But judges found that Likud members had filmed themselves voting, breaking the secret ballot rule. The court ordered a fresh vote. Then, a week before, the court had frozen something bigger. The government wanted to restructure the broadcast media regulator, the second authority for television and radio. That regulator held the key to a deal, the sale of Channel 13, Israel's most Netanyahu-critical news outlet, to a tech entrepreneur named Asaf Rappaport. The court froze it all, keeping the old regulator in place. On Sunday, July 5th, Netanyahu's cabinet met and voted unanimously to reject both rulings. Justice Minister Yariv Levin, the architect of the 2023 judicial overhaul that sparked mass street protests, drafted the resolution. The government declared it would not recognize any decision, approval, or appointment from that court-imposed council. It was the first formal cabinet defiance of a Supreme Court order in Israeli history. President Herzog issued a rare public rebuke. Attorney General Baharev Miara called it a constitutional violation. Opposition leader Yair Lapid named it what it was, the most serious constitutional crisis in the country's history. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett invoked a single word: anarchy. But inside the coalition, cracks were already visible. Culture Minister Miki Zohar floated a theory: Netanyahu would ultimately back down. The math didn't hold. Elections were scheduled for October, and the window to reshape the courts or break them was closing. Three and a half years ago, Netanyahu unveiled a plan that shocked the country. In January 2023, he announced a judicial overhaul that would strip the Supreme Court of power. The reforms would require a nearly impossible supermajority, 14 of the courts, 15 judges, to strike down laws. The Knesset could override any court ruling with a simple majority vote. It was a blueprint for judicial capture. Within days, hundreds of thousands filled the streets. Pilots refused to fly. Reservists threatened to refuse deployment. Labor unions went on strike. The country ground toward a constitutional breakdown. The October 7th Hamas attack paused the debate. But the government never abandoned the plan. In January 2024, the court issued its answer. A panel of 15 judges, led by Chief Justice Yitzhak Amit, ruled that the law banning the reasonableness doctrine was unconstitutional. More, they affirmed, for the first time explicitly, that the Supreme Court had the power to strike down even basic laws, the closest thing Israel has to a written constitution. That decision said the court was not a co-equal branch. It was the branch with veto power over everything. The 2023 overhaul stalled. But it never died. By July 5, 2026, a new pressure was building. Netanyahu's coalition was fragmenting as elections approached. Justice Minister Levin began circulating revised reform proposals more modest than 2023, but aimed at the same goal, limiting the court's authority. And then the court ruled twice in a single month, blocking 2 government initiatives. Netanyahu's response was not to negotiate. It was to defy. The constitutional crisis unfolds while Israel is bleeding on 3 fronts. Fighting in Gaza has ground on for 9 months. Hezbollah in Lebanon has escalated strikes across the northern border. Iran has signaled its willingness to strike directly the existential threat Netanyahu invokes constantly when defending his war decisions. When your country is fighting on multiple fronts, a fractured command structure is not a luxury crisis. It's a military liability. The security establishment has said this openly. The IDF chief, the Shin Bet leadership, reserve officer movements, they've all warned that a constitutional breakdown weakens Israel's ability to wage and win wars. But that alarm has not deterred Netanyahu. His coalition depends on the far-right parties Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who oppose any Gaza ceasefire and want to expand military operations into Lebanon. They need the judicial overhaul to stay, because the court has repeatedly blocked or questioned their decisions on settlements and warfare. The timing is surreal. In the middle of a military crisis, the government is moving to unilaterally defect from the institution designed to check executive power. President Herzog warned that this path leads to the collapse of the rule of law. Former PM Bennett said it invites anarchy. But here's the part that should concern you. The government's war cabinet is already split on ceasefire decisions. The US and Arab nations are pushing for a Gaza settlement. Netanyahu's coalition is refusing. Add a neutered Supreme Court to that equation, and the security establishment faces a choice: follow orders from a government with no judicial oversight, or refuse. That is the precedent Bennett invoked. That is where this leads. Netanyahu's coalition isn't a coherent bloc, it's a hostage arrangement. Ben Gvir and Smotrich need the judicial overhaul blocked to protect their controversial settlements and military decisions. The ultra-Orthodox Shah's party needs draft exemptions for religious students. Justice Minister Levin orchestrated the 2023 reform push and now defends July 5 as separation of powers. Each faction holds a veto. None can afford to walk away before October elections. The military and intelligence chiefs rarely speak against their civilian leadership. It happens during wars, usually in whispers, in memoirs written decades later. This week, they spoke in public. The IDF chief issued a statement warning that a constitutional breakdown would severely damage Israel's capacity to fight. The head of Shin Bet Internal Security made similar warnings. President Isaac Herzog, a figurehead with almost no executive power, broke protocol and issued a rare public rebuke. Attorney General Gali Baharev Miara, in an official statement, called the cabinet's July 5th vote a violation of constitutional law. Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister who sat in Netanyahu's cabinet for years, invoked a single precedent. In Israeli military culture, soldiers can refuse to execute illegal orders. He said the security establishment now faced that choice, not hypothetically. Now, that language matters. When a former defense minister and prime minister suggests that soldiers might refuse orders from their civilian leadership, he is not making an abstract legal point. He is signaling that the security establishment might splinter. By Monday, July 8th, reserve officer movements, the backbone of Israeli military manpower, had begun circulating petitions. Some reserves threatened not to report for duty. Others called for mass protest. This is the civil-military divide that brought down democracies in Turkey, Pakistan, Argentina. It starts exactly like this. The military questions the government's constitutional authority. Then it refuses to obey. Then it intervenes. Netanyahu's cabinet voted unanimously to defy the court. The security establishment voted unanimously to rebel against the cabinet. In early 2023, when the judicial overhaul was announced, the shekel fell 5% in 3 trading days. The Tel Aviv stock index dropped 2.7% in the first half of the year, despite global markets rising. Government bond spreads widened as rating agencies warned of downgrades. The market had priced the cost of institutional risk. Now, in July 2026, with the cabinet openly defying the court, that same calculation is underway again. The United States and major Arab nations have been pushing Israel toward a Gaza ceasefire and a transitional settlement for months. That deal is the cornerstone of a broader regional de-escalation, improved security with Lebanon and Syria, Iranian containment without direct war. But every diplomatic calculation assumes you're negotiating with a government that follows law. Netanyahu's cabinet just announced it won't follow law. That complicates everything. A strategic partner gripped by a constitutional crisis is unstable in ways that matter to American foreign policy. Does Netanyahu have the authority to sign agreements when his cabinet has just defied the courts? If the security establishment splinters, who speaks for Israel at a peace table? If Netanyahu is voted out in October, does his successor honor his commitments? These are not academic questions. They are the questions that decide whether a ceasefire holds. The Biden administration, or whoever leads the next one, has to manage a country that is, by its own cabinet's declaration, rejecting its constitutional order. The IDF is signaling it might refuse orders. The president issued a public rebuke. The attorney general called it illegal. And Israel is supposed to negotiate a post-war settlement with that government. Washington's leverage is limited. Cut military aid and you alienate Israel. Ignore the crisis and you're betting on a country that just voted unanimously to break its own rules. When a strategic partner loses institutional credibility, the partnership itself becomes a risk. That risk is now priced into every backroom calculation in Washington. Elections are scheduled for October 2026. Polls and political forecasts point in one direction. Netanyahu's coalition will be voted out. The far-right and ultra-Orthodox members who depend on the judicial overhaul will lose their seats or their leverage. A center-right government is expected to emerge, led by figures who have signaled a willingness to compromise on the judicial question. That sounds like a clean ending. It is not. The precedent is already set. A government has now formally declared that it will defy the Supreme Court. That declaration is on record. The next government, even if it is more pragmatic, inherits a country where that line has been crossed. The question is not whether Netanyahu's defiance will be reversed immediately. The question is whether anyone will ever cross that line again. The incoming government will likely restore the court's authority and abandon the overhaul. That is what the research suggests. But the window for court packing remains open. A sufficiently determined majority in the Knesset could still try to reshape the judiciary through legislation. They could try to force retirements, pack the bench, change the voting rules. The court's power depends on the Knesset respecting it. And the Knesset just watched a cabinet vote unanimously to stop respecting it. So here's what we're watching. Not whether democracy survives this moment, but whether the institutions that check power survive the moment when someone breaks the rules first. Netanyahu's cabinet did. The question is not whether they will be punished. It is what their act of defiance makes possible for whoever comes next. The institutions that constrain power work only when someone respects them. Netanyahu just showed what happens when they don't. That precedent lives on, no matter who wins October. Like and share if this matters. I'm David. See you next video.